This is lecture 9, Evolution and its Processes. This comes from the Concepts of Biology online open education resource textbook, chapter 11. So we can't really talk about, biology without talking about evolution, because as this one quote says, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So all species of living organisms evolved at some point from a different species. And so today we'll kind of talk about how that happened, how even though there's so many different things that are alive, as we've covered, how they're all related and how that kind of happened over time. So evolution is the process through which the characteristics of species change and through which new species arise. So hopefully by the end of this section, you will be able to describe the 4 basic causes of evolution, explain how each evolutionary force can influence the allele frequencies of a population, so how much certain alleles show up in a population, explain sources of evidence for evolution, define homologous and vestigial structures, describe the definition of species and how species are identified as different. How does that happen? So explain speciation, how different species arise. Identify common misconceptions about evolution and identify common criticisms of evolution. So the mechanism for evolution was actually independently thought of by 2 separate people, 2 separate guys. So they each kind of noticed some patterns and kept making observations and came to some conclusions. So they each did this, and that is kind of helpful because that shows, there's something to this. If 2 individual people not working together on this issue and this concept come to the same conclusions, that's kind of, extra meaningful. So the 2 guys were Charles Darwin, who we hear a lot about, and this other guy, Alfred Russel Wallace. So they were both naturalists, meaning they kind of learn by observing nature, going out into different environments and taking notes, making observations. So naturalists as opposed to, a molecular biologist or something like that. So each spent time exploring the tropics, by ship with stops at several different island chains. And then the last island chain that they each stopped at was the Galapagos Islands. So that, you might hear about it, but where is it? It's west of Ecuador, so kind of, by the equator and west of the country of Ecuador. So they each took different journeys around the world by ship, and happening to visit these tropical islands made a big impression on them because they noticed some stuff is really similar but also really, really different to stuff that we already know from the mainlands. So they were like, what? This is crazy. Why do these birds look like this? It's kind of similar to what we know of, but it's different. So Darwin observed that beak shape is different among different finch species. So he knew of some birds, some types of finches from, the mainlands. But when he got to the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that they were pretty different. There was a lot of variation among the different finch species that live there. So these are drawings or illustrations of 4 different finch species that live in the Galapagos. And they look pretty different from each other. You could see that this one has a really thick, big beak, versus this one is kind of a medium. This one's even smaller, and this one's really tiny. So there was a big variation in this one trait of beak size and thickness. So he was like, that's super weird. That's really interesting. Why are there these variations here as opposed to over there? So he basically figured that the beak of an ancestral species from the mainland came over here, ancestral species came over here to this island, and that ancestral species ended up changing over time and leading to these different species of finches, and having those different beaks helped each species adapt over time to equip to the different kinds of food sources that are on the island. So some beaks are a lot more helpful for like big, tough seeds. And then the small beaks are better for like small, soft seeds, and especially ones that are kind of harder to reach. So having like a small but like longer beak is a little bit more helpful to reach into like smaller crevices where you can get those smaller things. So yeah, the beak sizes is correlated to the kinds of foods that those kinds of finches can eat. So through these observations of, the finches were a big one, but he noticed like other kinds of organisms too that were similar-ish to the mainland, but also very different and kind of specialized to the environment there. So each of these guys, Darwin and Wallace, said that offspring with inherited characteristics that allow them to best compete for limited resources will survive and have more offspring. So in any kind of environment, there are limited resources. There's not like unlimited trees and unlimited seeds. Resources are pretty limited. And so if there is variation in the different traits, so for example, beak sizes, if there's like a variation of like big to small beak sizes, the ones that have traits that help them better compete for those limited resources are more likely to survive. So if you are able to find food, you're more likely to like live and then be able to reproduce and have more offspring, versus other species that are at a disadvantage and maybe can't access the food that's there. So they might end up, starving to death or something, so that they don't live long enough to be able to survive and reproduce. So if that happens in one generation, that's going to affect the next generation. If the one with the kind of like more advantageous trait is able to reproduce, then it just kind of makes sense that the next generation would have more of those, because those were the ones that were able to live long enough to reproduce and have offspring. So there's going to be kind of more of those individuals with those traits versus the ones that are harder, like have a harder time competing and getting resources and surviving to reproduce. They're going to have like less representation in the next generation. So yeah, because characteristics are inherited, then these traits will be better represented in the next generation. So if there is a characteristic that allows them to better compete for limited resources, then that will kind of show up more in the next generation. And so this concept, it was Charles Darwin that put a name to it, and so that's why we kind of remember him more. So he put a name to it and called it natural selection. In like the formal definition, natural selection is the greater relative survival and reproduction of individuals in a population that favor heritable traits, leading to evolutionary change. So in other words, natural selection is kind of the idea of that nature is gonna like select for traits that just give like a little bit of an advantage and let them live to reproduce. And then so over time, those traits that are beneficial are going to become like more and more common. So that's how like long-term evolutionary change happens, is over generations. This cycle of some of them are going to live because they're better adapted to like be able to get those limited resources or not get killed, versus other ones that have a little bit of a disadvantage. So that's just going to end up becoming less common because those individuals are going to die and not be able to reproduce and carry on their traits. So this does kind of like, really tie to the things that we covered last unit with, genetics and Mendel. He noticed something gets passed on, and so Darwin noticed something gets passed on, and that's why traits kind of become more common after generations in a population. So he was looking, at multiple individuals, not just like one little family. He was looking at the bigger picture, like if there's a whole population of these finches that have these traits, and how common are they in the bigger population, yeah. So here is an example of natural selection that they some naturalists tracked over time. So by studying the beak sizes of birds on one of the islands called Daphne Major, over like a long period of time, you can track these traits and like the how common certain traits are over generations in the whole population over time. So that's what they did. They studied the beak size over years. And so in general, the beaks that have large beaks, or the birds that have large beaks, are able to feed better on large, hard seeds because they have, the strength in their beak to be able to like crunch on those large seeds that are pretty tough and hard. Versus if you had like a smaller beak, you wouldn't be able to eat that large thing or break it down. So then if that's all that's available, you're going to have a hard time finding enough to eat and, survive. So large beak birds do better feeding on large, hard seeds, and then smaller beak birds feed better on small, soft seeds. Which makes sense because you don't need like a big, tough beak to be able to eat the large seeds. But all of this depends on what seeds are available at the time. If both are available, then maybe there will be an even mix of both kinds of birds with large beaks and soft beaks if there's both kinds of seeds available. But there was a drought on this island of Daphne Major, and so that drought ended up reducing the number of small seeds available, and that caused many of the small-beaked finches to die. So if there weren't that many small seeds available, then those small-beaked finches ended up dying and passing away from like not getting enough, nutrients and So then, because those ended up dying, and it was the larger beak birds that were able to find food because there was only large seeds available, they were the ones that were able to get enough food, survive, and reproduce, and so the next generation of bird happened to have more individuals with large beaks, and then the same, over generations. So in 1976, there was about like an even beak size. So there were some with bigger beaks and there were some with smaller beaks, but there was kind of more individuals with like a medium beak size because that was a good like adaptation. It was a good medium for like the two different kinds of seeds. But after the drought in 1977, years later, when they looked at the survivors in 1978, there was way less birds. And of the birds that were there, the beak sizes tended to be bigger because the generation of birds that had larger beaks were able to get more food, feed on what was available, survive, and then produce offspring. And then the ones that had smaller beaks were not able to eat what was around. And so they basically starved to death. And so that means there would be less of them able to reproduce and have, carry on those traits. So then the next generation happened to have slightly bigger beaks because those were the ones that were able to survive and reproduce in the previous generation. So after multiple generations of this, this led to a bigger pattern of birds happening to develop to have more like larger beaks. I'm trying to be careful with my words because it's important to say things objectively because it's not like the birds are choosing to develop a larger beak. It's just that the beaks that were large were able to get the food that was already around, and so they were able to survive and pass on their traits. And then the ones that were smaller beaked were not able to survive and pass on their traits. So over time, you see more common big-beaked birds versus smaller ones. But it's never like the bird's choice. It's just natural selection. Nature is choosing like who gets to live and who gets to die, basically. So that is the like example of natural selection that came from studying these populations of birds over time and over generations. So natural selection can only happen if there is variation. So a lot of like differences, a lot of variation among individuals in a population. So say you had, that population of birds, and there was some that had small beaks, some that had medium beaks, some that had large beaks, and like all in between. So natural selection can only happen if there's a lot of variation, and then nature will kind of select who gets to live and who gets to die based on like what helps them in that environment at that time. And that's also a big thing to note, like things change over time, and that's why it is helpful to have variation. So for example, like say that drought that ended up taking out like a lot of the small beaks, say all of a sudden there was flooding, and for some reason that some other condition changed and now there's only small bird seeds available, that's going to change. So conditions always change in an environment, and so the more variation there is, the better, because then there's going to be some individuals that are actually better suited to that condition at that time. So that is important. Variation can only really happen, natural selection can really happen if there's variation. And so the variation among individuals in a population, like the beak size, have to have some genetic basis. Otherwise, it's not going to get carried on to the next generation. So, for example, if what's a good example? I guess I'll give an example in the next few slides. But there has to be some genetic basis, because that trait has to be able to get passed on to the next generation for the next generation to benefit and natural selection to like actually work. And so genetic diversity and variation comes from two main sources: mutation and sexual reproduction. So we will talk a little bit more about these on the next two slides. So mutations. How do mutations contribute to variation? Well, basically everything, like all the variation that exists now and all the different species and things that exist now come from mutations. It's really kind of like crazy to think about. So mutations are changes in DNA, and that is the ultimate source of new alleles or traits or like variation in any population. So we did talk about like DNA replication, and most of the time the machinery that copies DNA is pretty good at it. Like it makes an exact copy most of the time, but it's not perfect. There's always going to be like a slight chance that a mutation can happen. The wrong base letter is put in the place where it's supposed to be. There might be a wrong letter, and sometimes that makes a difference, sometimes that doesn't. But that's how there is different variation in things, like an eye color, brown versus blue, that came from a mutation that made that like divergence possible because of, the central dogma of biology and how genes get expressed. Like if there's any change in DNA, that is going to lead to a change in proteins and phenotypes. So all this is like really, even though it feels like, okay, we just jumped from genetics and molecular bio to this, it is all relevant because it all starts at the molecule of DNA. So mutations can have three different outcomes. It could be helpful, it could be harmful, or it could kind of just be neutral. So mutations can have an effect on what we call fitness. So not fitness in the like terms that we think of, like like fitness, like health. Fitness, when it applies to like population genetics, means likelihood of survival. I don't know how it came about. Maybe how it's like, if something is more fit, it's kind of like a better fit to the environment, and so it'll survive more. So in this context, fitness is likelihood of survival. So some mutations can have the effect of giving it reduced fitness, so a lower likelihood of survival. And then that means like a fewer amount of offspring. So that's one possibility, like a possible outcome. A second possible outcome of a mutation, maybe it has a beneficial effect on fitness. So maybe the bird population, some mutation happens that now there's an even bigger beak, and that's going to help possibly the individuals that happen to, develop the bigger beaks. So mutations can be beneficial on fitness, like happen to give a higher likelihood of survival. But a lot of mutations, called neutral mutations, will end up having no effect. And yeah, that just kind of comes from one of the mechanisms of like gene expression. It depends where the mutation happens. So sometimes a mutation can happen and it might not actually end up making a change in the protein. So it really just depends on what the mutation is, like where, and on the environment. Because like I said, with variation, some stuff is harmful, some stuff is beneficial, but if conditions change, like those things might be reversed. Like all of a sudden something that would have been beneficial is now harmful in this new condition. So yeah, mutations can have different effects. It could be helpful, could be harmful, or could be neutral. But mutations are ultimately like the source of any new allele, any new genetic trait in any population. And ultimately that's like how all the different species arrived, basically, through mutations over long periods of time. And so that's one method of genetic diversity in a population, like how that arrives. Another one that we've talked about already is sexual reproduction. So through sexual reproduction and having gametes have like so many different possible combinations of like recipes, and that having like random chance of fertilizing another gamete that has all these different kinds of possibilities. There's so much genetic variation that can happen because of sexual reproduction. And so that's another like source of the genetic diversity. So again, not all parents and offspring look exactly alike. There's a lot of diversity because the big like possible change and mixtures that are possible through sexual reproduction. So mutations and sexual reproduction are how variation exists in a population. And then natural selection acts on the population and all these different variations. And so eventually, over time, a heritable trait that helps the survival and reproduction of an organism in its present environment is called an adaptation. So when things happen to have traits that are really well suited to their environment, and it's like a good match of the organism to the environment, we would call that trait an adaptation. So yeah, an adaptation is kind of like a match of the organism to the environment. And again, whether or not a trait is helpful depends on the environment at that time. The same traits aren't always going to be beneficial or a disadvantage because environmental conditions can change. So even though one adaptation can happen, conditions can change, and now that's not really helpful. And one thing that's important to note is that evolution leads to adaptations. Natural selection leads to adaptations. So it's kind of like a misnomer when people say, oh, this thing adapted to its environment. That's like right and wrong at the same time. Like humans, yeah, we can like kind of adapt to a new environment, but that's still a different term than an adaptation as it relates to populations and evolution. So again, like in science and in biology, terms mean very specific things. And so if you were to say, yeah, like individuals adapt to their environment, that's not really true. And when we talk about adaptations, yeah, it's not like anything chooses to adapt to its environment. It's just a result of this process of natural selection and of having some traits that are beneficial in that environment versus not. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify that because that is kind of like again, you kind of have to be pretty careful with language in sciences, because like, yeah, it has to mean a specific thing, and you can't really leave room for like ambiguousness. So evolution leads to adaptations, but it's not like the goal of evolution is for stuff to evolve, or like organisms don't have goals. It's not like this population of finches chose to adapt. It's just that evolution led to adaptations. So hopefully that makes sense. So when we look at the big patterns of evolution, we can apply different kinds of terms based on like how things evolved. So divergent evolution is when different forms in two species had a common ancestor, and that's why these two very different species have kind of similar things. They diverged from a common ancestor. So in evolution, that results in different forms in two species with a common ancestor is divergent evolution. So like in plants, the reproductive organs of flowering plants can look very, very different. But they kind of are still very related. So these reproductive organs of flowering plants ends up in two very different forms. And that's just because, yeah, like natural selection ended up leading to this form in this environment, in this species. And natural selection led to this form in this environment, in this species. So they like maybe originally kind of came from one common ancestor, but by being separate and being in these different conditions, natural selection ended up showing two different forms of this one thing. So that is divergent evolution. When you see something that's like kind of similar in each one, but very different because they diverged over time. Versus convergent evolution is an evolution that happens to result in similar forms on very, very different species. So for example, wings in bats, their structures are super, super different than wings in insects like bees or butterflies in these little, pictures. So even though we would both, we would consider these each wings, the wings are very different. Like if you look at the wings of, like a bee or a fly or whatever, that's definitely not the same kind of wing as like the wing of a bat. So those very different species kind of like evolved on their own and just happened to form similar looking forms, but it's not like they each diverged from the same thing. So if you were looking at different species of bats and they had, similar wings, that would kind of be divergent evolution because they came from like a common ancestor. And so that's why there's kind of different forms. But convergent evolution is like these two structures are kind of similar, but that's kind of just by luck, by chance. They both ended up having wings, but they're obviously very different kind of wings. So it's not like they came from one. I mean, ultimately, yes, everything comes from one common ancestor, but not a close one. So hopefully that makes sense. So some other terms, when we look at evolution on different scales, we would have different terms. So microevolution is studying the changes in a population's genetic structure over time. So for example, the study following the finch bird beaks. So microevolution would be studying just that population structure over time. So you're kind of studying evolution on a micro scale by just studying one population over time. Macroevolution is like bigger picture, a broader scale of evolutionary changes over a longer period of time. So micro, as a prefix usually means like small. So it's like you're zooming in on one population, so just those finches and the beak size over time. But macroevolution is big. Macro, like macroeconomics, is kind of bigger picture. Macroevolution is a much bigger picture of like paleontological time, so like thousands to millions of years. versus like a few years. So that would be the difference, like microevolution versus macroevolution. And so when you do study a population's genetic structure, or like how common certain alleles are over time, that's what population genetics is. So population genetics is the study of all alleles in a population. Some alleles can be like highly beneficial, and eventually, so remember when we talked about genetics, alleles are just different versions of one trait. So like eye color, there's different alleles like brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes, hazel eyes. So alleles are just different versions of one trait. So population genetics studies all the alleles in a population in like a, very numerical, quantitative way. So if we were to count up like and quantify like the beak size, you're studying the different alleles, even though it's not just like big versus small, like you can have way more alleles. So if you study population genetics, you might find, big picture patterns. So highly beneficials may eventually, like over few generations, become fixed, meaning every individual in the population will have that allele. So having a beak at all, that would be like a fixed allele. Or if every single individual had like a certain color eye, that's what it would mean for an allele to be fixed. And then over time also, like harmful alleles may end up being eliminated from the gene pool. Because they're harmful, those individuals just have zero chance of surviving, and so that allele might just end up dying off with somebody. So a cool example, I think, of studying population genetics is studying these moths. So this is a really good example of how traits can be beneficial in some environments and conditions and then harmful in other ones. So say we're studying a moth population, and there are some moths that are like dark colored. There are some moths that are like light colored. And so there's already that like variation, right? So say you're in the woods, maybe in some environments, like in the woods, it's more advantageous to be light colored because you're kind of blending in to the trees that are light colored. And then, sometimes it's advantageous for the dark colored moths because they can blend into like a dark environment. If they're on like a dark tree, they're gonna kind of like blend in better and not get eaten. So sometimes natural selection is not just like how you compete for resources, like literally. Sometimes it's really just like also who's gonna get eaten, because remember there's a whole chain, a food chain, food web. So sometimes it's also like, well, how can I live the longest? So light colored moths are better against a nice, light colored environment. Dark colored moths do better in like against a dark color background environment. So in 19th century England, when the Industrial Revolution was happening, that changed things. So all of a sudden, people in 19th century England, because of the Industrial Revolution and like burning coal, there was a lot more like soot in the air and in the atmosphere and environment, and like falling because of burning coal. And so there was a lot of soot falling. And so this actually changed, the countryside in England. And so because there was more dark colored soot falling everywhere, now that changed the environment. So any moth that was light colored is all of a sudden going to stick out a lot more because there's like this dark soot on everything. So it changed the environment from kind of like light environment backgrounds to dark. So the ones that were light colored ended up getting like eaten more often than the ones that were dark colored and, fit into their background. And so over time, different generations of that happening in the population, it actually became more common over time because of natural selection, that the dark color allele became more common in the population, just because those were the ones that lived, reproduced, and then that's why there was more in the next generation. Because now the light colored moths ended up getting like killed and eaten. So this was an example of population genetics studying traits and alleles and how they can become more or less common over time in different environments. So there is an online simulation that kind of shows this, really cool. So if you're interested and want to actually like see that kind of play out, I'll attach the link on Canvas. But yeah, it's really interesting, and that really helps you think like, okay, it's not like things are choosing to live or die or whatever. It's just what you happen to be born with and how that does at that time. Yeah. So again, hopefully that makes sense. So there's different other things as well that kind of contribute to evolution. So we call these the mechanisms of evolution. So how does it like actually happen over time? And the 4 most important evolutionary forces are natural selection, which we did, talk about. Mutation, which we also kind of covered a little bit. And then these other 2 things that, I'll explain more in a couple slides, but genetic drift and migration or gene flow. So these things, all 4 of these things contribute to evolution and how alleles get carried on over time. So number 1, natural selection. Depending on the environmental conditions, a phenotype, so remember the phenotype is like what shows in a photograph, so what something looks like. Depending on environmental conditions, a phenotype can give either an advantage or a disadvantage to an individual. If it's an advantage, then that individual will likely have more offspring than others. And then that means that allele will just kind of have more representation in the next generation. And if it's a disadvantage, then that individual is kind of less likely to have offspring than others because they're going to either like die from starvation or get killed and like preyed on. So then those alleles, if it's a disadvantage, will happen to be less common in the next generation. And if the environmental conditions stay the same, then that next generation, the offspring will also benefit. And so over time, the allele will become more common in the population. So here is a good example that also kind of relates to what I was saying with the moths. So in mice, there's already variation where there's some mice that are black and some are tan. And if they live on this like volcanic rock or something that is very dark, the ones that are black will happen to like blend in better than the ones that are tan. Like those are going to stand out a lot more to predators. So some mice are going to be eaten by birds, and there might, be some black mice still eaten, but it's going to be more common that the tan mice get eaten. So there's less of them around. So that's like tan mice are going to be eaten at a higher frequency than the black mice. And only the surviving mice that do reproduce leave offspring. So now if there's going to happen to be more black mice living, they're going to be able to pass on more, and produce more black mice. The tan mice will also be around to reproduce. There's just not as much of them. So the next generation, there's going to be more black mice and less tan mice. And again, it's just because the black mice lived and can reproduce, and the tan mice, most of them got eaten, and so there's just going to be less of them to reproduce and be around in the next generation. So that's how things change over time. It's really just like cycles of this, like over long times of generation that end up showing changes in the allele frequency in a population. And so, yeah, this is what I was saying with the like light versus dark colored moths. If you stand out against your background, you're more likely to get eaten and less likely to be able to like live and reproduce and pass on your genes to the next generation. So natural selection is number 1 contributor to evolution. Number 2, like I said, is mutations. So mutations are the ultimate source of any new alleles or variation in a population. And again, this is basically saying the same thing, but that mutations can either give helpful things, harmful things, or neutral. It's really just on chance, on like what the environment says at that time. So mutations are how any variation is possible, and sometimes there's new variations that produce like a totally new allele or phenotype. So number 3, which we haven't talked about yet, is genetic drift. So this is another mechanism of evolution. Genetic drift is just the effect of chance on a population's gene pool. I know it's kind of like, what? It's just chance too? Yeah, like a lot of it really. It's the chance of like mutations. Like if it happens to make a change, first of all, and if the change is helpful or harmful. And so genetic drift is kind of just like, well, it's also just random chance on which individuals reproduce. So it's not like all individuals are guaranteed to reproduce. Remember that in sexual reproduction, like you have to have a partner. So some animals and organisms like don't end up finding a partner, and so they just happen to not reproduce. So they're not going to be represented in the next generation. So genetic drift is kind of just like, oh, okay, yeah, it is also random which organisms are going to reproduce and which ones might not happen to reproduce in that generation. And so that effect of just random chance on the next generation. So in this example, there are bunnies. There are like brown bunnies and there are white bunnies. And that's just, the variation. But say for some reason, these 3 white bunnies and the two white bunnies and the 3 brown ones on the right happen to not reproduce. They can't find a mate for some reason or whatever. And then it just happens to be all the brown bunnies that are able to reproduce. So that's going to affect the next generation. There's going to be more brown bunnies represented in the next generation than the white bunnies. There will still be some white just because of how, like the Punnett square, like if it happens to get both recessive copies, it'll be white. So there will still be some white ones, depending on the genetics of the ones that did reproduce. But so it's really just random chance that more of the white bunnies or brown bunnies reproduced, and so that's why the next generation there's more brown bunnies. And then if this generation only 2 of them reproduced, the random chance that this genetic combination is going to lead to all of them having this brown color and the same phenotype. So yeah, some of it is really it is random. So eventually it could lead to elimination of an allele, like the white color, just by random chance. So genetic drift is the effect of chance on a population's gene pool. Yeah, not every organism is going to be able to survive, and not every organism is going to be able to reproduce, and so that also does play a part in allele frequencies. So that's genetic drift. And then genetic drift can also be magnified by either like natural or human-caused events. So for example, like a disaster, like a natural disaster, or even like a human-caused disaster, like deforestation and things like that. So any kind of thing that really dramatically kills a large portion of the population, that is also probably going to be random. It's just random if there's a wildfire and the bunnies in this environment like happen to live or die, like that is random. So the ones that do happen to survive are gonna get to reproduce and pass on their traits. So when this happens, if it's like a huge natural or human-caused event, then this is called the bottleneck effect, because a large portion of the gene pool is suddenly wiped out. So it's called the bottleneck effect because if you imagine a bunch of different colored marbles in this bottle, I don't know who came up with this. So imagine a bunch of different colored marbles in this bottle. And there are, a lot of orange ones, there's some green ones, there's some red ones. So there's a lot of variation. But if you were to pour out the marbles from the bottle, because of the neck of the bottle, like only some of them are going to be able to come out, and it's kind of random. So this is like representing the event. And so the ones that survive, it's going to be random, but it's not always going to represent the diversity that was there. So some of them are going to happen to be killed, like this is the rest of the population. And the ones that do survive, yeah, it's not going to be representative of everything that was there that got killed by this natural disaster. So that's genetic drift. It is random, and even if it's caused by like human caused events, it's still random, like who gets killed in this way. So like a big event, it's random. And then the fourth mechanism of evolution is migration or gene flow. So there's going to be different populations of organisms, and some of them, are going to be able to just kind of move between the different populations. Like say one group of beetles sets up shop over here, and one group of beetles sets up shop over here, and they happen to be like different colors, but some of them can still move, and if they can still like reproduce with each other, then that's going to mix the genes and like increase diversity. So that's what gene flow is. The flow of alleles in and out of a population resulting from the migration of individuals or gametes. So say there's like a population of brown beetles and a population of green ones, and they happen to live, like far but close enough that some individuals can like move between. Now this population is going to get more like diverse, and there's going to be more variation, and they're going to be better adapted in case there's a change that ends up favoring brown in a new condition. So that's the fourth mechanism of evolution, migration or gene flow. And so we know that evolution happened because of these four main types of evidence. And we'll cover a little bit of each one. So fossils. So number one, fossils. They are super solid evidence that organisms from the past aren't the same as the ones that we have today. Like there weren't always the same species that are present now. It's a really gradual evolutionary change over time that led to what exists today. So for example, horses, we think like, oh yeah, there's probably always horses around. But like before the horses that we know, there were different like intermediate forms over time. So the series of fossils that we can find from, different amounts of time ago show this like evolutionary path of natural selection. So maybe at first there were kind of horse-like organisms that look like this, but that's based on what was available and the conditions at that time. But as conditions change over time, then that will end up leading to small changes that happen over generations, and then there's differences that, show. So there was a gradual drying trend that changed the environment of what these guys lived in 55 to 45 million years ago. And after the gradual change in the drying environment, there was like, different alleles that were more beneficial and got carried on more and more over time. And so these are like kind of the intermediates that happened at different points in time because of the changes in the conditions in the environment, in the landscape. When the landscape went to like a forested one, to like a prairie landscape, that's what kind of led to the horses that we think of now. So it's really like long time and small changes over that time. So yeah, again, it's not like horses directly came from these guys. They kind of like ended up diverging to that. Hopefully that makes sense. So number 2, evidence, type of evidence number 2 is the anatomy of different living structures. So the presence of structures in organisms that share similarities show that, like, well, this is really similar. And so it probably was like just small, tiny changes that ended up elongating this bone, like leading to longer versions of this bone and not getting selected for. And so, example, the bones and the appendages of humans, dogs, birds, whales have the same construction. Like, they're really similar if you were to study them, structurally. The fact that we have the same structure across humans, dogs, birds, and even whales, like, these are just different versions, different forms of the same kind of bone that happened over time. They had to just like have little small mutations that ended up elongating and being better beneficial for that environment, and so that's why it ended up kind of getting carried on that way. And so the fact that they're similar though different is evidence, like, yeah, this kind of was all the same thing that just changed over time and branched off in different ways. So we have terms for these different structures. So homologous structures, homologous is kind of like similar. A structure that is similar because of descent from a common ancestor is a homologous structure. So kind of like divergent evolution, that leads to homologous structures. So structures that are similar because of descent from a common ancestor. So the similar bones of appendages, those are homologous structures. Versus vestigial structures, those are structures that are present, but they no longer function. So how they say the appendix is kind of like a vestigial organ, like it's there because we needed it at some point, but we don't need it anymore. So vestigial structures are physical structures that are present in an organism, but no longer has any apparent function and happens, to be there from a functional structure in a very distant ancestor. So for example, some snakes do have pelvic bones, even though they don't have a pelvis and legs, but that's because they happened to descend from reptiles that did have legs. So some structures are just left over from that. Yeah. So that's also evidence, things change over long, gradual periods of time. And so some things stick around that don't really function anymore, but it's because they happen to be important for some distant ancestor. And so some structures that are absent in some groups often appear in their embryonic forms. So there's some forms and structures that even though when they're fully formed they're not present, you can tell when they're a developing embryo, whoa, that's weird. The genes for that thing are still there. It's just that now we know not to express those genes when they're fully formed. So that's another kind of form of evidence that some structures are absent in some groups after they reach adulthood or their juvenile form. But if you look at their embryonic form and they have that, then that's kind of whoa. It's kind of like a temporary vestigial structure. So for example, all vertebrate embryos, so anything that has a vertebrae, like a back, including humans, when they're developing, have gill slits at some point in their early development. And so that's weird, right? That's evidence that at some point we descended from something that needed gill slits, And so, like, our DNA still kind of has that. It's just that it gets overridden, and it's like, we don't need to make that anymore, so we won't express that. But it's still there, like, hidden in our genomes. And it only shows during early development. Another example, again, so great ape embryos, including humans, have a tail structure during their development that get lost during by the time they're born. So that too, like humans, if you see them develop, like have a little tail structure, and then it kind of just goes away. So again, it's kind of like a little temporary vestigial structure that only shows during development. And it's like crazy to see and realize, like, whoa, we still have the genes for this, we just don't express it anymore. So yeah, that's another form of evidence of evolution. Like, why would we have that? Because we descended from a common ancestor that had those things. Number 3, biogeography. So the fact that if we consider the way that the planet used to be and how things like moved and shifted over long periods of time, that kind of helps account for why we have similar things across very different places. So biogeography is showing that like the geographic distribution of organisms on the planet follows patterns that are best explained by evolution in conjunction with the movement of the different tectonic plates over time. So, for example, this kind of like flower that kind of looks like corn, it makes sense that it's across these very different continents that are so widely separated because all the continents like happened to be together at one point in time. And so if this kind of plant, the ancestor of it, existed on all these different plates that then ended up shifting over time, that makes sense why there's different versions of that flower in each place, because there's no way this like flew from this continent to this entirely different continent, or like the seeds got flown and exists in very different forms. So if we take that in mind with like, okay, these are very similar but also different and like really, maybe adapted to these different continents, but they're really like closely related, it makes sense that it's because they all descended from a common ancestor when they were all close together. And then 4 is molecular biology. So the fact that like everything that's alive has and uses DNA as its information molecule, and that's what like codes for everything, like that's crazy. This is not random chance. Like, it doesn't make sense if you don't, if you ignore evolution, So the fact that DNA is like the universal genetic material for everything that's alive, it's because we all descended from a common ancestor and that had DNA. And it's just tiny changes in DNA that account for the differences in different species. So yeah, if we look at the sequences of DNA, that can show how small changes in DNA over time end up leading to different proteins and then different phenotypes. And that's what accounts for all the different variation and different changes in long periods of time. It's really like down to the DNA. It all matters. It all comes down to these molecules of DNA. It's crazy. So that's why, I really emphasize learning about molecules and chemical groups and how they interact and stuff like that and all that. It's because it all does tie back to these tiny molecules, especially because DNA codes for everything. So, hopefully that helps also make sense of like, why do we spend so much time about chemistry? Because that set up DNA and how DNA is this molecule that ends up coding for all this stuff in your cells and how all that stuff ends up like showing your phenotype. And so how do we get from similar things and something that was maybe one species over time, like how do they become 2 different species? So that's what's called speciation. So the biological definition of species. is a group of actually or potentially interbreeding individuals. So it's really like something is one species if members of that population can breed with each other. And if members of two different populations can't breed together, then we consider those different species. And so, yeah, speciation is the formation of two species from one original species. So that can happen for different reasons. So say one species happens to kind of like two populations split. They can become two different species by two different ways. So allopatric speciation or sympatric speciation. So allopatric speciation means that there's like a separation of populations. Like literally maybe this flock of birds went way too far, and so now they're very, very separate from this other flock of birds. And over time, eventually, like, they just can't breed with each other, and so they like become so different they can't breed with each other, and so they're two different species. Versus sympatric speciation, that's in the same place. So something happens that they can't breed with each other anymore, even though they're living in the same location. So allopatric speciation is with geographic separation. So there could be different environmental conditions that make those two populations, differ. And that will cause natural selection to favor, different adaptations in each of those groups. And so those two different places could have different climates, different resources, different predators and competitors. And so enough time, they won't be able to breed with each other because of different barriers. So here in this example is different spotted owls. So you know how, like, especially with birds, there's like this version of this one or this version of this one. So this is the northern spotted owl, and then this is the Mexican spotted owl. And so at one point they came from the same species, but these populations got separated from distance, and then due to those local conditions, they each kind of had traits that better suited that environment. And eventually they could not breed together, so they were considered different species. So with enough time, there will be factors that develop that prevent those two different species from mating. So we call them different barriers. So either pre-zygotic barriers or post-zygotic barriers. Remember, zygote is like the fertilized egg. So it could be something that prevents the egg from getting fertilized, so pre-zygotic. Or post-zygotic, like something doesn't let that egg that's fertilized get developed. Or it does develop and then it can't reproduce with other ones. So you've heard of, I think it's donkeys and horses have mules. But mules can't reproduce with other mules. And so that's a post-zygotic barrier. Like, they can develop, but then they can't keep interbreeding. Versus pre-zygotic, like maybe they could try to breed, but it's just never going to be a viable zygote. So those are examples of speciation with geographic separation. And then there's also speciation without geographic speciation. So sometimes you can have a population, live in the same place, but some weird thing happens and now, like they can't fertilize, or they're just not around at the same times of the year or whatever. So one form of speciation could happen when there's a chromosomal error during meiosis, or the formation of a hybrid individual with too many chromosomes. So again, there's like, different reproductive barriers, pre-zygotic, post-zygotic. So this could be a barrier if like one individual has too many chromosomes or there's an error during meiosis, like then that's not going to give a viable offspring. So that will end up happening to like, limit interbreeding, because like it could happen, but it's not going to be viable. So yeah, that can happen without geographic separation. And this other example is when individuals of two different species reproduce, and they do have an offspring, but then that one can't reproduce. So like I was saying with like horse and mule, that is a barrier that can happen. Even though like these two things can live in the same place, they might not be able to reproduce or produce offspring that then reproduce. And then even time conditions. So yeah, some species, like they might end up having some variation where like this bird flock for some reason doesn't meet at the same time as this other population of like a bird flock. And so if they end up never meeting with each other and like reproducing, over time those can end up becoming, you know, two different species. So yeah, some of it is also kind of chance. And then lastly, some common misconceptions about evolution. So evolution is just a theory. Individuals evolve. Evolution explains the origins of life. Organisms evolve on purpose. Evolution is controversial among scientists. So these are some common misconceptions about evolution that people might say like, oh, you know, evolution's not real because of this or because of this. Or maybe they're not understanding this fact about evolution. So evolution is just a theory. Again, like terms in science and in biology are very specific. It might not mean the same thing as like when you use that term in English class. So in science, a theory is more than just like a hypothesis. In science, a theory is understood to be a concept that has been extensively tested and supported over time. So we have like things that are theories, but they're not like a theory like in terms of how we normally use that term. So we have, you know, the theory of the atom. We have the theory of gravity, the theory of relativity. So each of these describes something that scientists like understand to be facts about the world. So in science, a theory is like a known thing, not just like a hypothesis. You know, that's why we have the word hypothesis to mean that thing. So in science, we have theories, and these things become like, you know, fact. And so like the theory of gravity, nobody's going to be like, oh yeah, gravity is just a theory. Like it's been shown and demonstrated over time, and it's very, understood to be fact. So a theory in science has survived significant efforts to discredit it by scientists who are naturally skeptical, you know? So if there's a theory in science, it's a known fact because it's survived, and there's been so much data supporting it and nothing that can like discredit it, so we accept that basically as fact. So people say like evolution is just a theory. Well, in science, theory means something specific. It's actually like fact. So yeah. Another misconception is that individuals evolve. So it's not that. So it's not like, oh, one beetle decided like, oh, it sucks to be brown right now, I'm gonna be green. No individual organism decides to change like that. So an individual is born with the genes it has. These don't change over time. And so evolution acts on populations. And yeah, evolution through natural selection acts on populations. There's never like an individual that chooses like, oh, I'm going to do this because I'm going to get more whatever. It's really hard if you try to think about things with humans, because sure, humans can like work out, but that doesn't mean your offspring are going to be buff, right? So a lot of things like you kind of have to like change your thinking. And yeah, like I said, like it's kind of a misconception to think like, oh, humans adapt. Sure, we say that humans adapt because in some ways like humans can, you know, change their behavior or change different like things. But for other organisms, and again, the term adaptation is different. So yeah, it's not that individuals evolve and nothing chooses to evolve. It's just subject to natural selection, and what lives and reproduces, and what dies and doesn't get to reproduce, and that leads to changes over time. So it's evolution acts on and focuses on like the big picture, the populations over time, over generations, because some of them live and some of them die. Another misconception is that evolution explains the origin of life. So the theory of evolution is kind of just describing like once life happened and things lived and there's variation and all these different things happen, it kind of just like explains how populations change over time and how life diversifies and then speciation and all this stuff. But evolution doesn't necessarily like explain the origin of life. Like at what point did something become alive and evolution doesn't necessarily explain that, like the origin of life, or if there's anything that decided that things should be the way they are. So like when it comes to religious beliefs and stuff like that, it's still up to everybody to paint that picture for themselves, I guess. So there are still biologists that do think like, that are religious and just kind of like think, well, this is how things developed over time because, so yeah, evolution doesn't explain the origin of life or like how, yeah. This next point is I kind of already covered. So organisms evolve on purpose is a misconception. Nothing chooses to change a certain way based on the environment. A changed environment results in some individuals in the population benefiting and then producing proportionately more offspring than the ones who can't. And the variation that natural selection works on is already there. It doesn't arise all of a sudden in response to environmental change. The variation and that beneficial thing like has to happen to already be there. It's not like one generation is like, oh man, like yeah, it would be great if I was a dark colored moth right now, and then all of a sudden it was dark colored. Like, no. There has to already be dark colored moths in the population of dark and light colored moths, and maybe in betweens, and then natural selection works on what's already there. And so, for example, antibiotic resistant bacteria don't just decide to become resistant to an antibiotic. They are selected through being exposed to antibiotics. So there has to be some bacteria that already have the resistance. They had a mutation in the genetic sequence that happened to make something that was resistant to this antibiotic. And so through taking antibiotics, natural selection acts on what's already there. Some bacteria that are resistant to that antibiotic are going to be the ones that live, and the ones that don't have resistance to the antibiotic are going to be the ones that die. And so the antibiotic resistant bacteria are going to be able to survive and pass on their genes to the offspring, and they're going to be resistant. So yeah, organisms don't just like evolve something on purpose. It has to already be there, and then it gets passed on. Another thing, really quick, we're almost done. Evolution is controversial among scientists. That's a big misconception. It's really not. If it is, those are scientists that are not biologists. Biologists, like, you just can't help, like, but see the evidence, and, nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution in biology. So maybe it was controversial when it was first proposed back in 1859. But even within 20 years of 1859, when it was first proposed, basically every working biologist had accepted evolution as, like, fact and the explanation for the diversity of life, because it really, like, makes sense. And so there's really no experimental results or research programs that contradict the theory. And there's no evidence of that. There's no papers published in peer-reviewed scientific journals that refute the theory, because there's just no, it is pretty widely accepted as fact, because it just makes sense, and there's nothing that can disprove it scientifically. So sorry for the little extra long lecture, but yeah, evolution really is pretty important. So by the end of this section, hopefully you can describe those 4 basic causes of evolution, how each evolutionary force can influence the allele frequencies of a population, the sources of evidence, homologous versus vestigial structures, definition of a species, how species are identified as different, how that happens, explain speciation, identify common misconceptions about evolution, and identify common criticisms of evolution. So yeah, that is